all of you who may be listening throughout this expanse called Earth. It is Monday, November 28th, 2022. The new WCEG welcomes you. This program is Issues and Answers, and I am your host, Norman A. Carter Jr. On your computer or smartphone, you can hear us or view us by typing in WCEGtalkradio.com. Or in your browser, go to the browser, hit enter, and on the next screen, click the live stream tab. Or on your smart TV, smartphone, just go onto the YouTube icon and search for WCEG Network. WCEG stands for Worldwide Community Empowerment Group. Our programming goal is to leave you a little bit more informed and a little bit more empowered than you were when you tuned in. Our motto, we speak life into the community. Now, you may like us on Facebook, and you can view us live there. And you can follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Now, let me make this perfectly clear. The topics and opinions on Issues and Answers are those of moi, Norman A. Carter Jr., and my guest, and not the WCEG Network. So leave my boss alone. This is my show. These are my words and the words of my guest. And speaking of guests, I would love to introduce to you my illustrious guest today, Dr. M. Adrienne Jones. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
Welcome thank you so much.
WCEG.
Thank you for having me. I want to speak life into the community.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that. But I think because it's so relevant to our program that I give as brief as possible, your bio, because I think it's relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor at Morehouse College. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in political science from the City University of New York Graduate Center and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on the history and politics of Black Americans and on public policy issues related to the Black experience. Her doctoral dissertation, The Voting Rights Act Under Siege, the development of the influence of colorblind conservatism of the federal government and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is currently being excerpted for journal publication, if it hasn't already been done. Excuse me. Her first article, When Yes Means No, GOP Congressional Strategy and the Reauthorization of the VRA, that's the Voting Rights Act in 2006, is published in the July 2018 edition of The Forum. Her second article about U.S. presidential counter-enforcement of the Voting Rights Act has been accepted for publication by the Political Science Quarterly, and she is currently at work on an article that focuses on the Supreme Court and the development of the Voting Rights Act jurisprudence that's affecting us now. During the 2019 primary election season, Dr. Jones interviewed presidential candidate Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who's now a bigwig. Dr. Jones is an expert witness on issues of voter suppression and U.S. voting history, and regularly speaks about voting rights and the suppression with national and international news outlets. Her expertise provides a unique perspective to discussions about the Voting Rights Act, voting, Black politics, history, and public policy. Dr. Jones, welcome to WCEG.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, Dr. Jones, I know your time is limited, and I really appreciate the time that you have put forth to share with us. So I want to delve right into the racist origins of the Georgia voting rights elections. If you vote Georgia voting elections, runoff elections.
Okay.
If you would please enlighten our audience with that, please.
So Georgia has been prolific and consistent in its use of methods to suppress Black votes. And important to the majority runoff system that we're seeing at work now, right? People are early voting for the runoff between Warnock and Walker. For many years, from 1917, actually before that, but codified in 1917 was the county unit system. And the county unit system was like an electoral college for the state. So it assigned, I hope I get these right, 2 points, 2 county unit points to all the ruralities, 4 county unit points to all the towns, and 6 county unit points to the urban areas. And as you can imagine, in the state of Georgia, Black people lived in the urban and town areas. And as you might also be able to imagine, Black people were voting in the 1940s and 50s in the state of Georgia, not in the same numbers as after the Voting Rights Act, but definitely Black people were an important political force here in Atlanta and in other parts of the state. But because of that county unit system and the sheer number of ruralities, a statewide candidate who was Southern Democrat could pick up those rural counties, multiply them by the 2 county unit points, and always have the opportunity to win statewide, first in the Southern Democratic white primary, and then ultimately in the election. In 1962, the Supreme Court, as a part of this wave of one person, one vote decisions that the Supreme Court was making, it canceled the county unit system in a decision called Gray versus Sanders. Mm-hmm. So suddenly Georgia was without this important mechanism to make sure that rural whites controlled the electorate. And so they established at the state legislature, essentially an election committee, kind of like we saw in 2020, 2021, to brainstorm about how they could change election law in order to make amends for the fact that they could no longer use the county unit system. And they came up with the majority vote rule. A legislator named Denmark Groover proposed it. And basically the idea is what we're seeing now, which is that if you have a general election and no one earns more than 50%, which if you have a Black candidate in the race, is very likely. That person might have a critical mass of Black support, but it's probably not going to take them over 50% in a general election, really in any particular locality in Georgia. So if you couldn't get over 50%, then you would be forced to have a runoff. And legislators understood that that meant that if there was a Black candidate in the race and say 2 white candidates, and the vote was split during the general election, also contributing to the inability to get to 50% among the white candidates, then the Black candidate and the white candidate who survived would go to a runoff. And then all of the white voters in Georgia could coalesce around that white candidate at the runoff stage and make sure that they won. So that's what we're seeing this year, right? We're seeing Reverend Warnock didn't make 50%. Walker is right behind him. So Warnock actually won the race, just like he did in 2020. But yet, because of the majority vote rule, Walker has an opportunity to go to this runoff and perhaps coalesce the white Republican base behind his candidacy and result in him actually becoming the senator for Georgia.
It's really unique, but not that unique because that's all over the South. Well, not all over the South, but you have several
and it's
states.
Not unique to Georgia because
Correct.
Georgia sort of at every turn, when it has deemed it necessary, has created something new in order to have control over voter turnout in the state. So we saw the 2020 elections. The former president claims that was stolen from him, even though perhaps not from other Republican candidates. Then we ended up in 2 Senate race runoffs. And both of those involved not taking the initial winner. And Warnock won that race too, and he won the runoff in that instance. But, in a unique aberration, John Ossoff came in behind in the general election and then was actually able to win the runoff. And that, in terms of our history and in terms of the use of this mechanism in order to limit Black candidates in particular, was very rare, right? The majority vote rule tends to benefit overwhelmingly the majority party, which was initially the Southern Democrats, which is now the Republican Party. Both of those parties, of course, being based on white voter bases.
Yeah. Denmark Grover, who you happen to mention, in case our audience is not aware, was a staunch segregationist. And if you don't think that this is a racist policy, there's an interesting quote by him from James McKay, which says the Negroes in pressure groups and special interests are going to manipulate the state and take charge. So there was this racist fear from way back in the 60s, and we're seeing evidence it now. And one concern that I have that no one seems to want to talk about is that for this to maintain this racist policy, it's cost the state millions of dollars.
Oh, it's very expensive, right? You have to have an entirely separate election. You've got to motivate people to get out a second time. And that's important for Black listeners, right? Statistically, turnout goes down for Black voters in the runoff. Now, SB 202 that was issued in 2021, it shortened the period, right? I mean, we've just talked about whether or not we can have Saturday voting the other day.
Right.
Ironically, because it fell behind Robert E. Lee Day.
Right.
Now called a state holiday. But
the irony of it all.
This means a second time that a person might need to take off of work or might need to make a special effort to go to the polls and make sure that they vote. Now, this is a special electoral time, of course. I live right across in Fulton County from an election place, and the line has been around the building since Saturday morning before 7. So, it seems that voters in the state are taking advantage of the opportunity to get out and participate in this runoff. And that might actually be because it's closer in time than it would have been before SB 202, because it would have taken 9 weeks as opposed to just the 3. So, I'm interested to learn later if that was of benefit to minority voters, older voters, youth voters, all of those voters who can be injured by voter suppression tactics waged by the state.
I think one of the things that I talk about, Doctor, often is that the Republicans are taking a victory lap because they're saying there's no voter suppression. Look at all the people voting. But I think what's happening now, and I could be wrong, is that people fear losing something as precious as their ability to vote and to have their vote count. And that's what's driving people to the polls.
Yes, I do not think that there's a correlation between the high turnout and the fact that they have passed their SB 202 voter integrity law, right? People are motivated because they know that they might lose the right to vote. People are also motivated, I think, because they don't necessarily want to send Herschel Walker to be the senator for the state of Georgia. He's revealed himself to be untruthful, to have some problematic lies from his past that are directly relevant to his campaign platform now. He does not appear to be as prepared for the position as Reverend Warnock. Reverend Warnock also is an incumbent at this point, even though, he had the special election in 2020. And so now he needs to be reelected for an official term. I think that he's proven himself to be pretty productive in the role and able to bring benefit to Georgia and able to establish trust with Georgian voters. So I've seen, for example, that there was some mobilization around Republican voters who voted for Kemp and Warnock in the original general election. And I've also seen some advertisements that to me resonated as GOP voters, one in particular with an older woman who I perceived as being a GOP voter who said she simply couldn't trust sending Walker to the Senate. I wish their names had different first letters. And so I think that for this runoff election in particular, where usually Black people's turnout goes down in the runoff, one, because it's 9 weeks later, perhaps it's healthier because the stakes are high. There's the balance of power in the US Congress, in the Senate, even though the Democrats have it, one more vote is certainly not going to hurt, particularly with the changes to the majority in the House. And I think Georgia voters, like other states, are specific voters. We saw how Governor Kemp was able to very artfully avoid getting into it with the former president. And Georgia voters, even those I think who supported the former president, understand that they're at home when they're voting in Georgia. And so I think some of those folks who were partial to the former president still voted for Governor Kemp because, they were thinking home in terms of their judgment and not sort of, wide nationally as we might, as might occur because the former president has such a presence and is able to draw his base and people who are amenable to his message in very effectively. But Georgia is its own state. Georgia voters are smart and they're thinking. They do have opposing views, but they think and take seriously the responsibility of voting in Georgia for Georgia representatives.
Dr. Jones, this is my personal disclaimer that I, like many, I'm from the north. I'm from Philadelphia, but it boggles my mind that a few weeks ago or a couple of weeks ago, I saw you on a newscast speaking about the racist origins of the runoff elections. And during my 20-odd years here in Georgia, I have never heard one politician, one social activist speak about this subject. Do you have an opinion on that? That is so strange.
I think it's not strange for Georgia. The state really from its first constitutions insisted upon controlling the input of Black people into the politics. So in 1877, just fun fact, there had been a post-Reconstruction constitution written. And as soon as I'm concerned that I gave you the wrong year, but after Reconstruction, let me put it this way, after Reconstruction, Georgia revised its constitution and invited Black legislators into the state house. So 17 or 22 state legislators elected were Black who were in the state house. And so the state was able to get reunified into the United States, right? The Confederacy had broken off. Now states are trying to get back into the Union, as Abraham Lincoln really wanted them to. Even after he was dead, he wanted, to reunify the country. So Georgia revises its constitution, has elections, Black legislators get elected, they ratify the 14th Amendment, and they get permission to be reunified into the United States. And as soon as that happened, they kicked out all the identifiable Black legislators in the state house. Now note that this is a bipartisan effort, right? So we think of, the Southern Democrats or the Democrats and the Republicans being, significantly different. Of course, we know they're not. But, on a bipartisan basis, they booted all the Black people they could identify, not the people who were too light-skinned to be seen.
Right.
And then they got kicked out of the Union again. So Georgia had to, invite those legislators back, revise the Constitution. Then they had to ratify the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment at that point, which is why 1877 was the wrong date. We're talking late 1860s.
Okay.
And then they were finally reunified again in 1870. But as soon as 1876, 1877, when Reconstruction was over, Georgia began earnestly to suppress Black voters, the election of Black people in Georgia. And I am of the belief, having looked at the entirety of the history, that, statewide Black leadership is exactly what the state has resisted, right? We saw Abrams attempt to become the governor twice. I'm sure that, Georgians had not contemplated a Black girl governor, so that adds another layer. But Reverend Warnock is the first person elected to Congress as a Black man since Reconstruction.
Right.
So It is not strange that we are talking about the racist origins of the majority vote rule, the adoption of at-large elections, changing of the rules when Black people want to run, attempting to break off cities or jurisdictions when Black people get into power. We've seen it in the last couple of years, the removal of election officials who are Black. This year, because of the redistricting, sitting county commissioners are being removed before the end of their terms. We've seen the racist advertising, particularly in the last electoral round. I mean, these kinds of tactics, we've seen exact match being challenged. I mean, it's just like any and everything that we can possibly think of that seems like a neutral law that can be applied discriminatorily, gets an opportunity in the state of Georgia.
It brings to mind Randolph County, Georgia, in 2020, where the voters were really overtly disenfranchised by the closing of polling places at the last minute. And this is a predominantly African-American community.
We saw the long lines in 2018.
Right. And I know your expertise goes to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the gutting of that by the Republican Party. Could you just comment a little bit about that?
So you were talking about my dissertation, and my dissertation really talked about the arc of time between 1965 and 2013, right? So what I saw was that in the federal government, even though it wasn't politically possible to gut the Voting Rights Act in 1970 or 1975 or 1982 when it was reauthorized before, the arguments were building, right? I mean, states like Georgia resisted the Voting Rights Act in 1965 when it was being debated. They resisted the Voting Rights Act in 1970 and in all of the years in which it was reauthorized. So it was sort of like growing, just a low fire, because once the Voting Rights Act was passed, legislators have Black constituents in all of these southern states. So it's not politically feasible to just be like, oh, whatever for that law because we don't like it. So there was a little bit of savvy, and a growing in development of conservative movement, right? So we see how the GOP has stacked the White House, stacked the court system, in the 80s, established the Federalist Society and started grooming conservative jurisprudence in law schools and then in various offices around the country. And so, it was really by conservatives an attempt to say, look at how much progress civil rights has made. We want to have that same kind of influence. And it took, 30, 40 years, but we're seeing the fruits of that. And in 2013, of course, we saw Justice Roberts hold that the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, its most important piece, right? This requirement that said that a state like Georgia, if they want to pass an SB 202, if they want to pass a majority vote rule, that rule has to be evaluated to determine whether or not it discriminates against minority voters in advance, not with litigation later where elections are passing by, but in advance, they have to determine whether or not they're being discriminatory. Justice Roberts believed that history had developed to such a point that the pre-clearance was no longer necessary. And he also forwarded the importance of equality of the states, which is a rarely used precedent that derives from Dred Scott. So since 2013, none of the states that were subject to preclearance, including the state of Georgia, have to submit any laws for review for discrimination. And so they can pass an SB 202 that contemplates clearly ending Sunday voting, because it's clear that that's when souls go to the polls.
Right.
Now, that particular provision was adjusted, and we do still have Sunday voting, but we have a bevy of other laws in SB 202 that give the state more power to determine whether or not they're going to certify the vote. I mean, it's not clear, for example, if the former president decides to call down here in 2024 and ask for 11,780 votes, is he going to be able to do that under SB 202? Because that ultimately is the goal, right? This is ultimately the beef between the former president and Governor Kemp and Raffensperger, which is like, I called you and asked you for the difference, and you didn't do it.
Right.
And, those gentlemen presumably didn't do it because it was against the law.
But there was an expectation.
But now we have both a potential expectation and a more friendly legal environment in which to suggest that perhaps we won't certify the vote. Perhaps we will send fake electors. Georgia, for those of you who are not from here, had a slate of, substitute electors ready to go and submit to Vice President Kemp on the day of the insurrection. And, maintaining the franchise means developing a situation where elections are in fact secure. They're not secure like the gaslighting double talk that the big lie projects. They are secure as they have been in 2020, this year, and in other years, because Georgian volunteers and the Georgian electoral administrative system works already.
I'm hearing Frederick Douglass in my ear. Power concedes nothing without a struggle. But anyway, that's going way off the base.
It is on point though, because
Yes.
People, I think, are apathetic also, right? We have a lot of voter apathy. People have had the right to vote for a long time. I think they take it for granted. I've heard young people tell me that they aren't necessarily motivated by stories about the civil rights movement. And so I'm not sure, what it takes for you personally as a listener to decide that, civic engagement is going to be important, but it's crucial at this point, especially if it becomes impossible to vote. It means we're going to have to be even more creative about how to be clear and deliberate about contributing to the selection of decisions that are being made for our locals, counties, and the state of Georgia.
My favorite saying is that if votes didn't matter, there never would have been strange fruit hanging from poplar trees.
And if votes didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying to pass SB 202. Talking
Correct.
about, oh, look at the turnout. It's
Correct.
working. It's fine. If it worked, the voter sticker would not say, I secured my vote right now.
Absolutely. Doctor, I know your time is valuable, but I'd like to just touch on one area before you leave. And this includes both political parties. Do you perceive there is a tone deafness in both political parties when it comes to the needs of minorities and Americans living in poverty?
Absolutely. First of all, I think that Black people have been, staged as the enemy in the United States. And so, in Georgia history, there's been a lot of traction in elections based upon that, right? We don't want these Black people to take control, so you got to get out here and support us. And so, yeah, I think it's problematic, and we haven't solved that, right? We haven't. And frankly, in my opinion, poor people have a lot in common. This is the whole point of this system, everyone, right? I'm saying we've had years where since the 1600s, where they have separated poor white people and poor Black people, right? They want to make you a slave patrol and they want to have slave patrols over you. Okay, so now we're at odds. But in fact, the reason to do that is to keep mass movement apart. The Constitution does not contemplate mass protests, mass control. The Constitution wants you to do Republican democracy where you elect the people and they go down there and, you know, sort of do the choices and make the money and have some control over what the government is going to look like. So, you know, I study Black people, but I'm constantly reminded that I should be studying poor white people because ultimately, these are the two groups of people who are not benefiting as a result. And we see all the tension and the violence and the hostility, I think, of folks against Black people now. But I wish people would understand that that is a ruse. That's designed to keep you occupied while, you know, the 1% has control over all of the people and, you know, maintains environments like, you know, not enough hospitals in the state of Georgia, you know, not enough job availability for people and safe housing and, you know, the kinds of things that we want from our state, local, and national citizenship here in the United States. And we need to stop being distracted, maybe do Thanksgiving with some people who are not the same race as we are, so that we can find some of these synergies. Because it's, you know, this election did not go as poorly and as dangerously as we thought it would, but we are not out of the woods. I saw that Octavia Butler was covered in the New York Times. If you have not read any Octavia Butler, brace yourself. It's very frightening, but you should probably read it. You know, it's a dangerous time. I've also been reading about the Holocaust, and people think that's absurd. You know, that could never happen today. That could absolutely happen today.
Yeah,
I know we don't want that. I personally think I'm too old. I don't want to go to internment camp or be restricted in my, you know, ability to move freely and exist in my country. But these are the kinds of stakes that we're talking about.
And that's not hyperbole.
It is not.
It's not hyperbole.
This is real talk. And so I need you to be participating at the polls. And I also need you to be thinking about getting more informed about who's running, what the offices are, and how you can participate in alternative ways. Because if voting becomes sort of, you know, perfunctory and just decorative, it's going to require that we already be invested in civic arenas where our voices can be heard. The point is to shut you off the table. And you need to figure out, I mean, we as a people need to figure out how to be at the table.
Yeah, I think one thing you pointed out, and it's rather Machiavellian, where you keep the little people fighting among themselves, and then they just come by and pick up the scraps, and that's what's happening.
And so this is why, back to your original point, you know, neither political party is really, you know, going all out for Black people. So Black people, you know, I'm going to need you to think about that and not just pass over to the party that's doing even less for you. But again, try to figure out how you can be a part and how you can encourage your family, friends, the community to get into position to be able to decide, you know, what your community looks like and what the environment and atmosphere is going to be like there.
Awesome. Doctor, I really thank you for so much time,
You're welcome.
so much of your time, your wisdom. I mean, this has national implications. And I really, really, really thank you for spending time with us here at WCEG. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. I really appreciate your being here. Much. Thank you so much, Doctor. And now, sure enough, thank you.
Bye-bye.
And now, you know, folks, I get into my little evening rap where I just jump all over everybody. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Jones for joining us. giving us her expertise in a matter that I wish more political activists and more politicians would talk about it. But there's something about Georgia, and I'm talking to my African American constituents, my African American politicians, my African American political activists. You just seem to be too scared to jump on this topic. I don't know why, but it's important. And for everybody, the runoff elections are costing us millions of dollars a year, not just in campaign contributions. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about taxpayer dollars that could be going to educate our children. But let me go on my little rant here for today. Here's a quote. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a tract on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. That came from Republican President Abraham Lincoln. Another quote. When fascism comes to America, it will be waving a flag and carrying a Bible. That's Nobel Prize winner in literature, Sinclair Lewis. Excuse me. I don't want anyone to forget that 147 Republicans voted to overturn the election results in 2020. 147 Republicans. Nobody, not even the Democratic candidates who are running in the midterms mentioned that. The Republican lawmakers raised objections to the official certification of electoral votes in a joint session of Congress that went into the wee hours of Thursday morning in a futile effort to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Why was there no national Democratic push to vote out all of these congresspersons who overtly or tacitly supported the insurrection of 2021, which was a coup attempt, and if successful, would have ignored the will of the people of the United States of America? You need to stop this nonsense about blindly supporting Democrats or blindly supporting Republicans or blindly supporting libertarians and not holding them accountable. You need to stop that. Fascism. Most of you don't even know what it is, but you hear it every once in a while. It's an authoritarian, nationalistic, right-wing system of government and social organization. Now, judging by local and national campaign commercials and the press releases for candidates running for office in the midterm elections of 2022, it seemed as though both parties played on fears and emotions rather than facts and concrete plans. In Georgia, the election results were confounding, if not fearful. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, let me take a sip on that, who has made several anti-Semitic statements, aggressively confronted Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, supported those who attempted to overthrow the government, and is a vocal supporter of the far-right QAnon movement, handily won her re-election to the U.S. House of Representatives this past Tuesday. beating Democrat Marcus Flowers with 66% of the votes. That's polled by the Associated Press. Herschel Walker, with no experience in government, leadership, or community service, garnered enough votes to create the need for a runoff election in Georgia for the position of U.S. Senator. Similar to Marjorie Taylor Greene, he lives in an unempirical reality where he fancies himself as an FBI agent, police officer, college graduate, valedictorian, and a supporter of military veterans. This guy is a case for Dr. Wanzo. Dr. Wanzo, are you listening? None of these are true. Yet, just as his mentor, Donald Trump, he flies through the American political atmosphere on a carpet of lies. Over 1 million Georgia voters think these are acceptable qualifications for a U.S. Senator. Now, that is understandable when you realize that for decades, Georgia has consistently scored at the bottom in American education. That's a fact. That's not making that up. It was not until 2001 that school became mandatory for 5-year-olds. Prior to that, elementary school for children in Georgia began at 7, which is 2 years behind most states in this country. You tell me Georgia is forward thinking? There's a reason to keep people ignorant, because when you keep people ignorant, you can control them. The problem, as I see it, is not this generation of wacko Republican leadership, but the virulent malignancy that supports them. In case you've been living in a vacuum, these militant and angry denizens habitating an American cesspool of deceit and chaos are gearing themselves for a civil war. Why do you think they support arming Americans with assault rifles? It's not hyperbole. All you have to do is listen. Instead of spending your time watching soap operas and whorish wives or whatever programs, spend some time watching C-SPAN. Listen to the unfiltered speeches and presentations of legislators, gun lobbyists, and fascist-leaning sycophants of former President Donald Trump. Trump is the living version of Damian Thorne. I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any votes. If that's not demonic, he is certainly deplorable. But what does that say about his followers? Excuse me. Let me quote the motto of Morehouse University. Et facta est lux, which is Latin for "and there was light," as the opening words of Genesis signifying the birth and creation of enlightenment born from knowledge and education. Here at WCEG, in keeping with shining and revealing light on issues affecting our well-being, we seek to enhance your knowledge of those things within and without your control. Voting is within your control. We're in the midst of early voting here in Georgia. That's happening right now. Final election day, December 6th. No excuse. But to be an effective voter, you must seek knowledge and education. As Dr. Jones just told us earlier, she said it. I'm so glad she said it. Education. You have to be an educated voter. You cannot achieve that by living in an alternative reality buttressed by misleading commercials and pundits of perversion. These are designed to lead you to and keep you in darkness and despair. You cannot be lazy and obtain all of your news from CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News, Facebook, Twitter, or even WCEG. You must be energetic in the pursuit of all sides of a story. That will allow you to glean the wheat from the chaff, the facts from the fiction, and become a critical thinker. Fascists and deplorables abhor critical thinkers. When is the last time you went to a city council meeting in your city? Excuse me. When was the last time you voted based on character rather than political party? Up until the mid-1960s, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation. It was Republican President Dwight Eisenhower who sent troops to Mississippi and Arkansas to desegregate schools. Brown versus Board of Education came under a Republican administration. Now the Dixiecrats, who controlled the Democratic Party of the early 20th century, have migrated to the Republican Party. That's a fact. If you paid attention to history and current events, you would know that already. Now, not waving our flag too much, but here at WCEG, we were the first nationally or internationally available media outlet to expose the fascist influence that dominates the Republican Party. And we did that in January 2021. But because this information came from a Black-owned station with a Black host and producer, far too many counted us as unworthy of their attention. It's like Noah building a 475-foot, 3-decked ark, warning folks of a flood, and being either ignored or ridiculed. But just as Noah, WCEG and Issues and Answers will continue to build our ark of understanding and education, for we speak life into the community. We are not talking about the community of regional Atlanta or Georgia. That is myopic thinking. But the worldwide community, that's why we call ourselves Worldwide Community Empowerment Group. Thus, let us get back to elections and voting. Got kind of off on a tangent here, but excuse me. Now, voter suppression is a fact, but you cannot be suppressed if you get off your knees and butts and vote. Stop listening to the facilitators of impossibilities who delge you with trivial excuses not to vote. If the polls are closed on Saturday, find another day or another way to vote. Think about those poor souls who became strange fruit hanging from poplar trees. They walked along dirt roads and back streets to voting polls. They were under the threat of death, not rain, not cancellation of Saturday voting, not cold weather, but death. Many of them made it to the polls and voted. To all of my ignorant naysayers, if the votes of these courageous souls did not matter, why were they threatened, beaten, and sometimes killed? All of this happened because votes have power. Votes matter. What is your excuse? Let us never forget James Chady, African American, Andrew Goodman, Jewish, and Michael Schwerner, Jewish. During the Freedom Summer Campaign of 1964, they were slain in Philadelphia, Mississippi, as they attempted to register African Americans to be qualified to vote. They were not murdered for nothing. They were murdered because votes matter. You can't change a thing by making comments on social media about racism, the economy, education, taxes, or your living conditions. You can be a cog in the wheel of change, integrity in government, and security in your community by voting. Excuse me. This virus is getting to me. And let us not give the Democratic Party a lot of credit. Making promises you cannot keep just to get elected changes nothing. Although you may have sincere, lofty goals, let your electorate understand that wishes become platforms that lead to bills. The bills that lead to laws only come to fruition when there is a large group supporting them. No one-man band can change a thing without the support of other legislators. That is why it is important for you to be an educated voter. Seek to understand the political realities of your time. There are Democrats and Republicans who want to erase part of history and teach lies to your children and grandchildren. That has a generational impact. We recently had a president who ridiculed the seriousness of COVID-19. His leadership led to the deaths of over 1 million men, women, and children. Excuse me. Convinced me that that is not a generational impact. How many potential doctors, lawyers, plumbers, bricklayers, and philanthropists were lost due to his murderous leadership? Votes matter. Trump won due to dummies saying, I don't like Hillary and I don't like Trump. I'm just not going to vote. Or far too many voted for Santa Claus. People died on battlefields of the world so that idiots could vote for a figure of fantasy, and people died. Shame on us. Georgia, we have an opportunity to show the world, yes, the world is watching, if we are ready for the 21st century. You cannot be as apathetic as South Fulton, Georgia was just a short while ago. You cannot opt out of an election that will impact you and your grandchildren. Let's be clear. Herschel Walker is a political step-and-fetch-it of our time. All of you over 65 know just what I'm talking about. We cannot allow this man to be elected to office and make Georgia a staple of comic routines in comedy clubs and television stations throughout this country. $3.5 billion in Medicaid funds, have been refused by our Republican governor just because the Affordable Care Act was the brainchild of an African-American president. There is no other reason. As a result, thousands of citizens are being denied adequate medical care. That's black and white. Black and white. Being denied adequate medical care because they cannot afford the cost. 7 rural hospitals in Georgia have closed since 2008, and 2 more are slated to be shut down next month. We just had one close here in Georgia, here in Atlanta. Wake up, folks. Wake up. Since 2005, 181 rural hospitals have shut their doors. That's across the country. Now, I'm just going to close with this. Elections have consequences. Herschel Walker will provide support to those insidious Republican ideologues who want to take America back to an era when America gave only lip service to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of its citizens. Elections have consequences. Hundreds of men and women and children are dead. Did you hear me? Dead or permanently maimed because corrupt legislators sold their souls to the National Rifle Association and gun makers. These pragmatic Second Amendment gun fetish devotees allowed war weapons to be bought and used on innocent people. They are blind and callous to the loss of life they have caused. Just as with Donald Trump, dead people are of no consequence. Their only allegiances are to themselves and those who give millions of dollars under the table. So Georgians vote. Americans vote. How many more must die from lack of medical care or gun violence for you to realize that elections matter? Votes matter. Voter apathy is the nourishment of fascism. Elections have consequences. Are you part of the problem, or are you part of the resolution? Look into your favorite mirror if you can face what is looking back at you. This is WCEG. I am Norman A. Carter Jr. I thank you. I thank Dr. M. Adrienne Jones from Morehouse College for joining us on this informative edition of Issues and Answers. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the closeout program of Issues and Answers for this season. But I will see you back here on January 9th, I believe, and I'll be looking forward to it. I'll be putting out advertisements on Facebook. Until then, have a joyous holiday season. Take care of yourself, both financially and mentally. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.